Our interview today is with Mr. G.E. Compton, Canton area, Route 164, Cadiz, Kentucky. Interviewed October 3rd, 1978 by Sally Elder. Mr. Compton, I'd like to know about the migration of your ancestors from North Carolina. I believe you have an early census.
In the census of 1790, which was the first census of Euen County, North Carolina, there were the names of William Rushing and William Rushing Jr., Philip Rushing, Abraham Rushing, Jacob Rushing, Mark Rushing, Matthew Rushing, Solomon Rushing, Noah Rushing, Roland Rushing, Sabrina Rushing, Robert Rushing, and Richard Rushing. Now, one of these Rushings was the father of my great-grandfather, William Rushing. William Rushing, the first account that I have of him, he was living in a blockhouse not far from Red's Hollow in Trigg County, Kentucky, back at the turn of the century, around 1800. He was born in 1797, and he grew up in Trigg County. He was a farmer and a flatboat pilot. Sometimes he would load up his flatboat and float down to New Orleans. And it happened that he was at New Orleans when they fought the Battle of New Orleans in 1812, the War of 1812, and he fought in that battle. He was 18 years old. He was one of the Kentucky riflemen. And his wife was Frances Everett. She was born in Georgia, and they married in Dover, Tennessee. And he had his oldest son was Theron, and just a minute, I hadn't had all those. I think we had those. Now, his oldest son was Abel Rushing. His next son was Theron Rushing, and his next son was my grandfather, William Jasper Rushing. And then he had a son named Wright Rushing, who, as a young man, left Trigg County and went to the Northwest Territory and settled around Spokane and finally at Seattle, Washington. And then he had a son named Joseph Rushing. And then he had a daughter named Ellen Kay. And Abel Rushing and Joseph Rushing died. One of them died one day and one the next. They died with a plague of measles. They had the measles and they died. But William Jasper Rushing was my grandfather, and he grew up and married Elizabeth Williams. And they had a son, Joseph. That was their oldest child. Their next daughter, Rebecca. And the next son was Samuel. And then there was a daughter, Nellie, or Panola was her name, they call her Nellie. And then my mother, Sarah E. Rushing, who married my father, George Compton. And then there was a sister, a younger sister, Minder. And most of these children all grew up to adulthood. But my mother married George Compton and raised her family here in Trigg County. They had 11 children. And this William Rushing, that is my great-grandfather. He raised his family here in Trigg County, and he died on the 18th day of October, 1854. He died rather young. And he was a veteran, of course, of the War of 1812, and he received 2 land grants. One of them on what we call the Blockhouse Creek, which is the next valley up the Kentucky Lake from the Red's Hollow. And that's the valley where my mother was born. And whenever William Rushing died, there was a cemetery not far from the Rushing Creek campground, which is, they call it Rushing Creek now, but it's Rushing's Creek.
Could you explain the difference in spelling, how they changed that?
Well, ever since there was a name for that community, it has always been called Rushing apostrophe S, Rushing's Creek, because it belonged to the Rushings. The whole valley belonged to the Rushings. And it's never been called Rushing Creek. It's always been Rushing's Creek because it belonged to the Rushings. And William Rushing is buried, I would say, less than half a mile off of the road that goes from Rushing Creek over to Pleasant Hill by Lar Furnace. I don't know what they call that road. They call it some kind of trace.
The other day you gave me more explicit directions in case anybody would be listening to this tape trying to find that graveyard.
Well, then years later, this property where the cemetery is located on was bought by a man by the name of Stahl, S-T-A-H-L, Stahl. And now they've got it listed in what books has it listed is listed as the Stahl Cemetery. But it was always known as the Golden Hill Cemetery. And William Rushing and I suppose his wife Frances are both buried there. Theron Rushing is buried there. He was a veteran of the Civil War. He fought for the Confederacy. My grandfather, Jasper Rushing, William Jasper, is buried there. Now, his wife, Elizabeth Williams, she was, after he died, of course, my grandfather died real young and left her with about 5 or 6 children, young children, while she married again. She married John Henry Joyce. And she lived with him and had one child. Julie Joyce, her name was, and she married Jack Turner. And they raised a large family. Brieford Turner, Perv Turner, and Noreen and Laureen Turner, and Bravo Turner, had quite a family. And so then, in the about, I would say 1881 or 2, she left John Henry Joyce. She left him, and she went to Paducah, and took my mother, and took my Aunt Nell, and little Minder, the smallest child. She took those children with her, and she died there in Paducah. And her grave is, I've never been able to find her grave. She's buried in an unknown grave down there. And so then my mother went to Louisville and stayed in Louisville with an older sister for 2 or 3 years, and then she came back down to Nashville on the train, got on a steamboat, came down to Canton, got off the boat, and went back out to Golden Pond to live with her sister Rebecca, who had married the Roach, Mr. Roach, Jordan Roach. And while she was living there and working on the farm with them, she married my father, George Compton. They married in Cairo, Illinois, and I'll never forget, my mother said that my grandfather, William Turner Compton, was a shoe cobbler. He made his own shoes and everything, and he made a pair of white boots. And my daddy was married in that pair of white boots. They were handmade, put together with hickory and white oak pegs. They didn't have any tacks back in those days. And so they came back to Trigg County and lived around Pleasant Hill and Turkey Creek and raised a family of 11 children. And I'm the last one. I'm number 11, born January 20th, 1911. And all the children grew to adulthood except 2. There were 2 died in infancy.
Now, is there another family cemetery then in this last generation?
For the Rushings or Compton?
Either one.
The Comptons are buried all over the whole, between the rivers, between the lakes district. There's my grandfather, William Turner Compton, is buried right over here at Long Creek on the hill. There's a marker at his grave. And Uncle Gibson, the veteran of the Civil War, he was on the Union side. He and Uncle Dick, Richard Francis, are buried at the old home place where my grandfather owned and died.
Now, where would this be?
You go out the Turkey Creek Road from Golden Pond, and you turn towards. You go all the way to what they call the dividing ridge. The dividing ridge between the 2 lakes. The water falls on one side, it goes to the Kentucky Lake, and on the other side it goes to the Barkley Lake. And you go out that dividing ridge, about a mile and a half to the old William Turner Compton place, and there's a cemetery there, and it's a family cemetery, and Uncle Gibson and Uncle Dick are buried there, and now my Aunt Etna, that's my father's twin sister, and Aunt Nancy, they're buried at Pleasant Hill. And Uncle Isaac Compton is buried, he had him a little private cemetery on a high hill right this side of the Rushing Creek campground. Up on a high hill there, right beside that road that goes to Laura Furnace.
Many people that are coming through doing research at our library are looking for their ancestors, especially to join organizations, and we're trying to give them directions to find these old graves and the people they can contact. And this is the reason we like to know how they can get to these old cemeteries. Are there roads leading to them?
Some of them you can drive within like my great-grandfather's cemetery, you can drive within a half a mile, and then you have to fight through the briars and the bushes to get there. They have not maintained the roads. The TVA has not maintained the roads to the cemeteries at all. Now, my grandfather's brother, Howard Compton, he stayed with my great-grandfather, Matthew Compton, in McMinnville, Tennessee, up until I suppose they died, about right after the Civil War, and then he moved from McMinnville here, and he's buried on top of a big hill right here at Turkey Creek, right just west of where my mother lived, where my father and mother lived, on Turkey Creek. They call it the Roach Tomb Hill. Her husband, Mr. Roach, built him a brick tomb, and he was aimed to be buried on the top of the ground in a tomb. He wasn't aimed to be buried. He was going to have a tomb, they called it. And before he could die and be buried, the lightning struck it and broke it all to pieces. And so they just went ahead and buried him right near where he built his tomb.
They didn't rebuild it?
No, they didn't rebuild it. No, they wouldn't let him be buried there anyway.
Did you have any of your ancestors that their graves had to be moved when the Corps of Engineers came in?
Not unless they moved some Rushings at Rushing Creek. Now, if I don't no, wait a minute. The Rushing Creek Cemetery was on a hill. The church was down at the foot of the hill in a little valley, the Rushing Creek Church, and the cemetery was up on the hill. They didn't move any of them.
Yeah, any cemeteries that were on the hill did not have to be moved.
No, they didn't move any. My father was buried at George Compton is buried at Turkey Creek, within 300 yards of where he's born. He was born right there by the Turkey Creek Spring. The Turkey Creek Church used to be there. I went to school there, my first school in 1915, when I was just in primer, they call it, first grade.
Now, you mentioned about all the families intermarrying. Can you tell me the lines that your family's intermarried with? I understand the Futrals.
One sister married Gertrude married a Futral, married Henry Burnett Futral, and two of my sisters, Floy and Niecy Compton, married two brothers, Hicks. One of them married Floyd Hicks, and one married Elvis Hicks. And Elvis Hicks just died about a year or so ago. And Mary Compton married her cousin, Watkins Compton. And if it hadn't been for the fact that she married a Compton, why, the Compton name, my family name, would disappear, because I've got two daughters and my brother's got one daughter. We don't have any sons. And now the second child was a son, but he died when he was about 2 years old. And after that son died, they had 6 straight girls. Now, part of my family, part of my sisters married people out of, one of them married a fellow from Virginia, one of them married a Filipino, and they're living in, they lived in San Francisco. And see, they were the only two that married from out of the state. The rest of them married here in Trigg County.
And you're the last one left in this actual area in Trigg County.
I'm the only one that's left living right around here. Gertrude died. It'll be 2 years ago this November, and Floy, the other sister, died. I guess a year ago last May, and I have one sister, Esther, who is just older than I. She's living in Daly City, California, just a suburb of San Francisco. I got a sister living in, who taught school in Trigg County for years. She taught several years here in Trigg County. Ella Compton married Burkett Owen Boyer. We call him Bob Boyer. He's from Virginia. They live in Richmond, out of Richmond on a farm. My brother, Henry Compton. Now, there were two Henry Comptons. Uncle Isaac had a Henry, and my father had a Henry. The older Henry, Uncle Isaac's son, was magistrate here in the 1st District between the rivers. It was then, and he's dead. And my brother lives in Royal Oak, Michigan.
Well, didn't you teach school in this area at one time?
I taught Pleasant Hill 3 years, and there used to be a school called Mitchell Chapel, which was situated on Highway 68, right exactly where the trace crosses 68. Of course, the schoolhouse is torn down. I taught that school in 1933, and that was the last year that they had school there, and they discontinued the school and combined it with the Golden Pond School, and that was in 1933. And then I went over to Michon's Bridge, over 4 miles out of Cadiz, and I taught over there 4 years.
Do you have any other memories of things you might have heard about your grandparents that we can put on this part of the tape? Things they did, maybe you inherited something from them?
Well, no, I don't. I've never seen a grandparent. The grandparents were all dead before I was born. See, I was number 11. My mother was 42 years old when I was born, and my daddy was 52 years old. I was the last one, number 11. I can remember going to the funeral of Euen Compton. That was my father's oldest brother who fought in the Civil War. I can remember going to his funeral. I can remember seeing Aunt Etna as my father's twin sister, and the one that was named Amanda that they called Babe, Aunt Babe. I remember seeing her. I remember seeing Uncle Matthew. My father had a brother named Matthew. My great-grandfather, of course, he was called Matthew too. And I remember Aunt Nancy. She married an Ahart, and he died. And then she married a Crowder, a fellow by the name of Crowder. I remember seeing her.
Are there any buildings, thing left of the old farmstead? Any log buildings or anything you've ever seen?
Well, while I was teaching school at Pleasant Hill in 1930, there was a log barn that stood on my grandfather's place up on the old farm up there. They call it the Willie Compton place. And the thing was built out of logs, and they took that clay, that yellow clay, and they would make it up into a batter, and they would take this short pieces of wood, and they'd put in these cracks of these barns, and then they'd take that clay and they would seal the cracks. And they would take their hands and put that up there. And I was coming home from the school up at Pleasant Hill one day, and I met a fellow, one of the old Nebo fellows, and he said, "Let me show you something." He said, "Look right up under the edge of that roof," and he says, "You'll see your grandfather's handprints." Said old Willie Compton, William Turner Compton, says he made up that mud, and he daubed, they call it daub, says he daubed that barn. And said, there's his fingerprints. And if I'd have thought, I would have gotten up there and cut out a chunk of that clay with his fingerprints in it.
Would have been very interesting.
Yes. But now, of course, that barn everything's gone. The TVA has destroyed practically every building, the old buildings between the rivers.
You never saw an old homestead or anything like that?
Well, yes, I saw his old place. It was built out of logs.
Tell us about it.
It was what it was. It was 2 separate rooms, and at one time there had been we called it a run. It was just sort of a walkway built on 2 logs between the 2 rooms.
Wasn't that called a dog trot sometimes?
Well, some people call it dog trot. We always called it a run because whenever it was cold or whenever it was raining, you'd always run across from one to the other, and we always called it the run. And the house that I grew up in had a run down on Turkey Creek. The big front log house in front and the old log kitchen behind, it had a run. We called it the run. And we'd always run during the rain or during cold weather. And so then they got the idea to close it in and make a hallway. So then a lot of the old buildings around here wound up with a hallway. Mm-hmm. Now there was one of the finest log houses in this community was the house that was built on Turkey Creek. It was built out of cypress logs. It was built out of hewn cypress, beautiful logs. And the last fellow that lived in that before the TVA ran everybody out was Luther Hendon. He lived there, and it was just as solid the day he moved out as it was before I was born. That building was built, I suppose, back in the 1800s.
And was this torn down?
It was sure is torn down. Everything's torn down.
It would have been a wonderful historical thing to save, I would think.
Well, yes, it would have, but
The TVA did not have a committee that came in to save historical things?
as far as I know, the TVA didn't. They tried to obliterate everything. They said they wanted to obliterate all signs of human habitation.
Like
Now they should have saved the village of Golden Pond as a little ghost town. I mean, it would demonstrate the way the people lived back then. Just like I said in the other tape.
Well, that's what we would like to get on tape, is these old things that were just completely destroyed, and now they are building an old village, starting all over.
Well, my father's house, the one where my father died. Now, when my father died, we didn't call the undertaker, and we didn't call the funeral home. When my father died, Mr. George Joyce, one of the finest fellows that I ever knew, he lived right across the field. He had the adjoining farm. He came over and he gave my father his bath and shaved him and what they call laid the body out. He laid him out. We went to Golden Pond and we got a shroud. I think the shroud cost $15. And we put my father's body in a $30 coffin. We put his coffin in George Joyce's wagon. He had two big brown mules called Bill and Nell, and we hauled my father's body to Turkey Creek Graveyard, and we buried him on Thanksgiving Day, 1919. Now that's the kind of funerals we had.
Much different than what we have nowadays.